The year 2020 was a year like no other for people the world over, including Africa. It was a tumultuous year due to the deadly COVID-19 pandemic. Nigeria was the first country in Sub-Saharan Africa to confirm a case of the novel coronavirus. This is how the country's health minister made the announcement.
The Ministry of Health has confirmed a coronavirus disease case in Lagos, Nigeria, known as COVID-19.
Hello, I'm Mubarak Kenya, and welcome to this week's edition of Africa Today, which will be highlighting on some of the major events that shook Africa in 2020. Apart from the COVID-19 pandemic, other events that made headlines in Africa include protests against police brutality in Nigeria, the military coup in Mali, the US forcing some African countries to establish ties with the Israeli regime, and the crisis in Ethiopia. So join me till the end for an insight on some of the events that made headlines in Africa last year.
Africa Review in 2020. Impact of COVID-19 in Africa.
We shall start off our program with the COVID-19 pandemic. As the year ended, there were over 2.5 million confirmed COVID-19 cases on the African continent, with more than 2.1 million recoveries and 60,000 deaths cumulatively.
According to the World Health Organization, COVID-19 transmission in Africa has been marked by relatively fewer infections, which have been on the decline owing to a variety of socio-ecological factors, as well as early and strong public health measures taken by governments across the region.
Most African countries are relying on the multilateral COVAX facility, which is unlikely to distribute vaccines as quickly compared with those countries that have made advanced purchases from manufacturers. The World Health Organization Director General, Dr. Tedros Adhanom, has expressed concern that poor countries might not get the vaccine.
The urgency with which vaccines have been developed must be matched by the same urgency to distribute them fairly. Every government rightly wants to do everything it can to protect its people. But there is now a real risk that the poorest and most vulnerable people will be trampled in the stampede for vaccines.
Now, while reports of a vaccine brought hope for an end of the COVID-19 pandemic, the emergence of a new variant of the new coronavirus in South Africa and Nigeria dampened expectations of recovery from the pandemic in the immediate future. South African Minister of Health, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, explains here on how they plan to handle the new variant of COVID-19.
This situation can be handled in the way that COVID-19 has been handled, even though it might be a variant. But it's actually important that you can handle it because the approaches are still the same as what we've been using dealing with COVID-19 as it had been brought to our attention. Many countries have experienced a second wave that was more severe than the first wave. So we're not different now to other countries. Many countries have gone through what we've gone through. Even in countries who have not themselves reported any mutations, we've seen that there's been an increase. So in our case, we're also seeing that that might be the pattern. So we must gear up for a stronger fight against COVID-19.
Every crowd has a silver lining. This has been the case with Africa, as the COVID-19 pandemic provided a springboard for innovations across the continent. According to the WHO analysis, 57.8% of health technologies and innovations in Africa were driven by information and communications technology, 25% were based on 3D printing, and 10.9% were robotics.
We talked to Dr. Roderick Chibi, who is the World Health Organization Regional Advisor for Innovation in Africa, and this is what he had to say.
You realize that countries relied on the already existing platforms. For instance, due to high mobile penetration in most of the African countries, there was an emergence of technologies or self-assessment and alert mobile applications that governments were able to deploy and mainstream in their COVID-19 response. You realize that population at large, for instance, in Niger, in South Africa, in Togo, population were able to screen themselves and also alert key stakeholders to manage if there are any symptoms that they needed to address. So we realized that where technological platforms were already in existence, it was easy to apply some frugal mind in terms of deploying some of those innovative approaches to countries. I can give you another example where we saw drone technology, which was deployed in Rwanda and Ghana.
That's the WHO Regional Director for Innovation in Africa, and stay tuned for more.
Ethiopia dam dispute and instability in Tigray region.
The regional dispute that dominated headlines in Africa in 2020 was the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Since 2011, the Ethiopian government has pushed ahead with the construction of the dam on the Blue Nile.
The project, which is set to become Africa's largest hydroelectric power plant, is opposed by Egypt and Sudan over the concerns that the dam will affect their water security. While the African Union has been trying to resolve the dispute through talks, the interference by the United States has further heightened regional tensions. In a telephone conversation with Sudanese Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok, U.S. President Donald Trump said that Egypt will have to blow up the Ethiopian dam.
And it's a very dangerous situation because Egypt is not going to be able to live that way. And they'll end up blowing up the dam. And I said it, and I say it loud and clear. They'll blow up that dam.
In reaction, Ethiopia's Foreign Minister Gedu Andargachew said the remarks by Trump are unacceptable in international law governing interstate relations. Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt have conducted several meetings under the brokerage of the African Union over the last few months. But they reached a stalemate every round they held on the technical and legal points of contention.
Ashok Swain, a professor of peace and conflict research at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University, explains here on what are the stumbling blocks in reaching an agreement over the management of the Nile.
Most of these issues have been addressed. The real problem lies if there is a long-term drought period in the basin, because the climate change has made it also quite a problematic. That if there is, and that reason is also quite prone to have long-term drought seasons. So if that takes place, how to share or how Ethiopia will ensure that certain amount of water reaches Egypt.
Now, apart from the dam dispute, Ethiopia has been in the news due to several ethnic conflicts in the country, especially in the Tigray region. The conflict in one of Africa's most ethnically diverse populous countries is thought to have displaced close to 1 million people and killed thousands.
Late November, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed announced the end of military operations in the restive region of Tigray after federal troops took control of the regional capital after a 3-week-old war that has shaken the Horn of Africa. Abiy's government started the operation to quell a rebellion by Tigray People's Liberation Front, which was the ruling party in the Tigray regional government. Abiy said his government had every right to launch the military operation.
The federal government had every right to deploy federal security forces and use force in order to apprehend those implicated in massive corruption and gross human rights violation.
Forces of the Tigray People's Liberation Front are still engaging in armed hostilities against the federal government troops in parts of the restive region. Over the last year, hundreds have also been killed in other parts of Ethiopia due to ethnic-related violence.
What needs to be done to stop possible balkanization of Ethiopia and heal the gaping divisions across the country? This is the question we posed to Samuel Getachew, a journalist with the Reporter newspaper in Addis Ababa.
And there has to be an adult conversation that needs to go on among Ethiopians. Are we becoming an arrogant nation where a few would be in control and the rest will be abused like before? Or are we going to have the kind of hope the Prime Minister gave many Ethiopians at the beginning of his term, including the protection of human rights, press freedom, and even inviting the opposition to come back home and compete in an election, the role of the diaspora, all this was discussed openly by Abiy Ahmed, and it gave many people, including myself, hope. But now I think Ethiopia has tilted to the back. It's like it's going back to the old era, and that shouldn't be. If we want a peace and prosperous nation, it needs to change, and the change should begin immediately before we also start another conflict in other parts.
Well, we all look forward to sustainable peace and stability in Ethiopia.
The Mali coup.
Mali, a fragile West African country, was once again in the news for the wrong reasons. Thousands of Malians took to the streets for several months, calling on President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta to resign over corruption and economic mismanagement.
Today is the last day of presidency of President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, and we are calling everybody to come out to support this popular riot.
A series of protests filling the streets of Mali's capital, Bamako, culminated in a military coup in August. Keïta resigned after soldiers seized him from his home. He appeared on national television to announce his resignation.
De son accompagnement au long de ces longues années, de la chaleur de son affection, vous dire ma décision de quitter mes fonctions, toutes mes fonctions à partir de ce moment. Et avec toutes les conséquences de droit, la dissolution de l'Assemblée nationale et celle du gouvernement.
How has the Mali crisis impacted on the wider Sahel region in Africa, especially considering the fact that regional terrorist groups operate in parts of the country?
Mali crisis there will definitely impact the rest of the countries, and this total instability in Mali, it means strength of these groups. If they become strong, who knows if they won't even spread across to the 5 countries as well. If they were to do that, then there's a danger. There's a big danger of the future of the entire region and also Africa. It will take a long time to kind of dismantle that kind of order. So what's happening in Mali impacts the rest of the region in a very big way.
The coup leaders established the National Committee for the Salvation of the People to set up a new government. On September 12th, the rebels appointed former Defense Minister Ba Ndao as transition president and formed the interim government set to roll for 18 months before the new elections are held. Africa Review in 2020. SARS protests and terrorism in Nigeria.
Over the past few months, Nigeria witnessed protests against a British-trained notorious police unit known as Special Anti-Robbery Squad, or SARS. The protests have been Nigeria's most powerful over the recent years. Though the protesters don't have a leader, the demonstrators are mainly young people who say they've been unfairly profiled by SARS.
All of us are tired. We're tired of the killings, we're tired of the extortion, we're tired of the harassment, we're tired of people that are meant to protect us killing us. It just doesn't make any sense. They are raping us. We are tired of everything.
Now, what are the underlying factors behind the protests against police brutality in Nigeria? To get an answer, we contacted Julius Mbaluto, an African affairs analyst.
You've had a huge chunk of youth who have been discouraged and felt suppressed by the regimes that every election has produced. You talk about all these former military men, from the current president, Buhari, and also even some of other former presidents have had military background. Talk even about Obasanjo, former president of Nigeria. But they are wealthy, they are rich, they are old, and therefore, for many, many years, a huge chunk of youth in Nigeria felt not really represented. And we are seeing a situation whereby the police and this court became the epitome of corruption and suppression and oppressing Nigerians.
Julius Mbaluto there, speaking of the reasons for recent protests in Nigeria. Stay tuned for more in our program today.
In 2020, Nigeria continued to witness deadly attacks carried out by the Boko Haram Takfiri terrorist group. Thousands were killed and many more injured. This terrorist group also kidnapped hundreds of people, including students. According to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, more than 30,000 people have been killed and nearly 3 million displaced in a decade of Boko Haram violence in Nigeria. Why has the Nigerian government failed to stop Boko Haram terrorism despite having one of the largest armies in Africa?
First of all, how is Boko Haram still around? I mean, literally, Nigerians have had enough of them. That we don't understand where this group came from. They do not represent any real Nigerians as far as we're concerned, whether they're Muslim or Christian. And also, how can any group like this be more powerful than the so-called Nigerian army with all of its resources? It's an absolute joke. We have to be clear about the international, support as well as domestic support that Boko Haram receives, where the average Nigerian is sick and tired and fed up of them, but they're not being supported in the northern towns in the country to defeat them. To be honest, we've seen a resurgence in Boko Haram, surprisingly, and no one can explain it, I'll be honest. As the government taken the eye off the ball since they declared victory, a couple of years ago. I mean, we have the video of, President Buhari declaring victory, and yet this group is still around. So I think Nigerians are still wondering that question themselves, like, how can they not defeat them with all the resources and the help they've supposedly received internationally? But again, the country has bigger problems to worry about, and we're demanding that the government deal with this Boko Haram scourge, which is not allowing the north of the country to truly progress.
U.S. pushing Israeli agenda in Africa.
Under pressure from the United States, two African countries, Sudan and Morocco, normalized ties with the Israeli regime in return for favors from Washington.
This pressure to normalize ties with the Israeli regime comes while the African Union has been a longtime supporter of the liberation of Palestine. But why is the Israeli regime hellbent on establishing ties with African countries?
I think the battle is to legitimize the settler state, to legitimize the practice of anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab racism as a norm, and to normalize that the occupation of Palestine and the subjugation of its people is something that is central to that agenda. But to be able to get away with it, they need to have sufficient consensus internationally, at least to be seen to be complicit and in recognizing the illegal occupation.
Refugees and illegal migrants.
Thousands of African refugees and illegal migrants fleeing war, poverty and persecution are dying, while others face harrowing abuse in their attempts to reach Europe's Mediterranean coasts.
Many risk their lives in this journey fraught with dangers. According to the International Organization for Migration, over 1,100, mostly African migrants, perished in the Mediterranean in 2020.
Bukangesa, an activist and commentator, says that Western countries are the root cause of this illegal migrant crisis.
The easier way to stop all this, escalation of immigration going to Europe is let the United States and their Western allies stop raining us with bombs. Because now look at the case of Libya, which is the most unfortunate case. After Obama sent the drones there and his friends in France, Gaddafi was murdered. Now we have anarchy there. We have, cells of terrorism there. But these people are fleeing war from their countries. These wars have not been caused by themselves, but they have been caused by, mostly imperialist wars that are taking place in the African continent.
Bukangeras there says that illegal immigrants are caused by Western imperialists in Africa.
U.S. dumping plastics in Africa.
In matters to do with the environment, over the last few months, there have been concerns that the United States plans to dump plastics in Africa and particularly in Kenya. In April, the American Chemistry Council members, of which include Shell, Exxon, Total, DuPont and Dow, proposed investments in recycling in Kenya, provided that the recipient country accepts U.S. plastic wastes. According to the plan, Kenya will get about 500 million tons of plastic waste exports from the U.S. per year. Greenpeace Africa voiced concern over the reports.
Plastics have been touted as major polluters of our water bodies, the rivers, the oceans. And this is something that Kenyans have rejected quite significantly. And we have a very strong law that prohibits single-use plastic. So this deal is very progressive and we want to reject it.
While it remains to be seen if the U.S. will go ahead with its plan to dump plastics in Africa in 2021.
African startups.
Nigerian startups contributed more than 17% of the over $1 billion funds raised by African startups in 2020. This is according to the data gathered by Startup List Africa on the African startup ecosystem. The report revealed that the funds were raised by over 280 startups in more than 350 deals across the continent in 2020.
However, there are concerns of digital colonialism as foreigners come to exploit local tech experts. A victim explains here how his innovation was stolen by counterparts from an American university.
When my partners were completing their MBA at Stanford University. So having newly raised capital and having a product that was already in the market, the plan was for them to come to Kenya and then we would set up shop and we would together grow the company and move it forward. Apparently, as much as I thought that we were working together as a team.
Silencing guns in Africa. The 29th Summit of the African Union, held in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 2017, declared the month of September of each year until 2020 as Africa Amnesty Month for the surrender and collection of illicit small arms and light weapons. While still on the same subject, Iran Ambassador to Kenya, Dr. Jafar Barmaki, has called for proactive action among African countries to address emerging challenges, including internal strife. The ambassador spoke last December during the launch of the World Cartoon Festival on applying arts and culture and silencing the guns in Africa, a competition that invites works of art from cartoonists across the globe. The competition will run from December 2020 to May 2021. Ambassador Barmaki elaborates here on the festival.
Through this festival, the Embassy, in line with the efforts of African Union, will accelerate the two calls to action by assimilating both 2020 and 2021 themes, which will enable a promotion of African arts, culture, and heritage, while fast-tracking on silencing the guns initiative.
Well, that's all we had on some of the news that made headlines in Africa in 2020. While the last 12 months have been as intense and breathless for Africa, we look forward to recovery and a prosperous 2021, where Africa will take its rightful place among the nations of the world. It's been great having you with us today, and on behalf of the entire Africa Today team, it's goodbye from me, and have a fruitful year ahead.